Imagine standing at the edge of time, brushing dust from stone that has not felt a human hand for thousands of years, and realizing that what you are touching is not just art, not just decoration, but a sentence written in a language so old that it predates alphabets, predates paper, predates the idea of history itself. Across continents that never touched, across oceans no ship could cross at the time, civilization separated by vast stretches of land and millennia of silence, carved, painted, and arranged the same shapes, the same spirals, the same stepped pyramids, the same serpent forms, sun disks, cross bands, and grids, and the unsettling question begins to form, slowly and quietly. What if these are not coincidences? And what if they were never meant to be understood quickly? In the jungles of Mesoamerica, the stone cities of the Maya civilization rise like frozen equations, every angle precise, every stair counted, every carving repeating patterns that echo endlessly. Serpents undulate along temple walls, their bodies segmented like coded lines. Spirals appear in glyphs and calendar wheels, marking cycles of time that loop rather than move forward. The Maya did not see time as an arrow. They saw it as a breathing thing, expanding and collapsing, returning to itself. The spiral was not art. It was instruction. It whispered that existence is recursive, that endings are folded into beginnings, and that meaning reveals itself only when you learn how to trace the curve backward. Half a world away, in the burning sands of the Nile, the builders of the ancient Egypt carved the same language into stone, but with different accents. The Ankh, a looped cross, appears everywhere, held by gods, painted in tombs, etched into walls. To a casual eye, it is a symbol of life. But the loop atop the cross mirrors the same circular forms found in distant cultures, suggesting continuity, a closed circuit, energy returning to its source. The Eye of Horus is not just an eye, it is a geometric assembly of fractions, a mathematical diagram hidden inside a religious symbol. Even the pyramids themselves, with their four faces converging at a single point, feel less like tombs and more like statements, as if Egypt was saying that all directions, all paths, all stories ultimately converge. Then there is the cradle of recorded history itself, the river valleys of Mesopotamia, where the Sumerians pressed wedges into clay and unknowingly stamped eternity. Their cylinder seals, rolled across wet tablets, produce endless repeating scenes, looping narratives with no clear beginning or end. The tree of life appears again, its branches symmetrical, guarded by mirrored figures, as if balance itself were sacred. The same stepped temple form rises here too, the ziggurat, a man-made mountain ascending toward the sky, echoing the same layered geometry seen in pyramids across the world. Why steps? Why elevation? Why this obsession with moving upward through discrete levels instead of smooth slopes? It feels less like architecture and more like a diagram of progression, level by level, stage by stage, as if consciousness itself were climbing. And then there is the quietest of them all, the most enigmatic, the Indus Valley civilization, leaving behind no long inscriptions, no deciphered language, only seals and symbols that refuse to speak plainly. On those seals, animals stand beneath strange abstract signs, repeated again and again. Grids appear, crosses, tridents, looping marks. No kings carved into stone, no gods towering over humans. Just symbols, compact and restrained, as if deliberately compressed. Whatever they were saying, they did not want it shouted. They wanted it preserved, hidden in plain sight, waiting. The same serpent winds through all of them. In Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent descends from the sky. In Egypt, the cobra rises from the brow of the pharaoh. In Sumer, serpents coil around sacred poles. In the Indus seals, serpentine forms curve with controlled symmetry. The serpent sheds its skin. It renews itself. It moves between worlds, ground and water, life and death. Across cultures, it carries knowledge, danger, and transformation. This is not metaphor drifting independently in isolated minds. This is repetition with intent. This is a word written 4 times in different scripts. Sun symbols follow the same pattern. Discs with radiating lines, circles divided into quarters, wheels that turn. The Maya tracked the sun with terrifying precision, predicting eclipses centuries in advance. Egypt aligned temples to solstices so perfectly that sunlight pierced inner chambers only on sacred days. Sumerian hymns describe the sun as an all-seeing judge, moving across the sky with mechanical regularity. The Indus cities themselves are laid out on grid systems that respond to solar movement, streets aligned with cardinal directions. The sun was not worshipped merely as a god. It was treated like a clock, a signal, a reference point for something larger. Even the obsession with measurement itself becomes suspicious when you step back. Standardized bricks in the Indus Valley, perfect right angles in Egyptian construction, astronomical numbers embedded in Mayan calendars, mathematical ratios encoded into Sumerian myths. These cultures were not just surviving, they were encoding. They were embedding information into structures designed to outlast languages, empires, and even memory. Stone does not forget. Geometry does not drift. Symbols survive where words decay. What if these civilizations understood something deeply unsettling about time and collapse? What if they knew that their spoken languages would die, their names would erode, their stories would fragment, but symbols could endure? A spiral does not require translation. A pyramid does not need explanation. A serpent carved in stone communicates instantly to the human nervous system. It bypasses intellect and goes straight to recognition. Maybe that was the point. Not to tell us who they were, but to trigger something in us when we were ready. Consider the possibility that these cultures were not leaving messages for their neighbors, or even for their descendants in a straight line. Consider that they were speaking to the future as a whole, to anyone, anywhere, who might someday notice the repetition and feel the chill of recognition. The message would not say, "We were here." It would say, "Pay attention." And maybe the message is not a warning or a prophecy, but a mirror. Maybe they were mapping the structure of reality itself. Cycles, balance, ascension, return. Symbols that describe how civilizations rise, peak, fragment, and disappear, only to be rediscovered by minds that think they are seeing something new. Maybe we are not decoding ancient symbols. Maybe the symbols are decoding us, measuring whether we have reached the same threshold of awareness they once crossed. Because once you see the pattern, truly see it, coincidence becomes the least convincing explanation. Independent invention explains tools and survival tactics. It does not explain shared metaphysics carved into stone across oceans. It does not explain why humanity, separated by vast distances and eras, kept returning to the same shapes as if guided by an invisible template. What if these civilizations were not isolated experiments, but chapters in a longer story? What if they were responding to the same underlying structure of reality, the same rules, the same hidden architecture that we are only now beginning to glimpse again through mathematics, physics, and code? And what if their symbols are still active, still functioning, waiting not for translation, but for recognition? Because messages do not always come as sentences. Sometimes they come as patterns. And sometimes, the most enduring message is not what is said, but what is repeated patiently across time, waiting for a future mind to finally ask the right question. Stand still for a moment and imagine the planet itself as a turning instrument, a vast dark sphere moving silently through space, carrying oceans, mountains, and civilizations across an invisible stage. Now imagine that long before satellites, before telescopes, before modern astronomy, human beings on opposite sides of this sphere pointed stone, earth, and belief toward the exact same place in the sky, not vaguely, not symbolically, but with precision so unsettling that even today we struggle to explain how it was achieved, or why it mattered so much that entire civilizations bent their sacred architecture toward it. At Giza, the pyramids of the ancient Egypt rise from the desert with a stillness that feels intentional, as if the land itself paused to let them exist. Their sides are aligned to true north with astonishing accuracy, closer than many modern buildings constructed with lasers and GPS. But north was not the true obsession. When researchers traced the angles of shafts deep inside the Great Pyramid, they discovered they once pointed toward specific stars, including those of Orion's belt, stars associated with resurrection and the afterlife. Orion was not just a constellation, it was a destination, a reference coordinate in the sky where the soul was believed to travel. The pyramids were not facing the heavens at random, they were locked onto a point that mattered. Now, cross continents and oceans to the jungles of Cambodia, where the vast temple complex of Angkor Wat, built by the Khmer Empire, mirrors the sky with a devotion that borders on reverence. At equinox, the sun rises directly over its central tower, perfectly framed, as if the building itself were designed to catch a celestial signal at a precise moment in time. But Angkor Wat does more than track the sun. Its dimensions, layout, and proportions reflect cosmic cycles, including the precession of the equinoxes, a slow wobble of Earth's axis that completes one cycle every 26,000 years. This is not knowledge gained casually. This is knowledge embedded deliberately, as if to say that the sky moves in patterns far larger than a human lifetime, and sacred structures must move with it, even if only symbolically. Travel west again to the high plateau of Mesoamerica, to the city of Teotihuacan, built centuries before the Aztecs ever arrived. Its Avenue of the Dead runs at a precise angle, not aligned to cardinal directions, but to the setting of the Pleiades, a star cluster revered across cultures as a marker of renewal and catastrophe. The pyramids of the sun and moon frame this avenue like parentheses around a sentence written in stone. The Pleiades were associated with world ages ending and beginning, cosmic resets etched into myth. Why would a city of tens of thousands orient itself toward a cluster of stars barely visible to the naked eye, unless that alignment carried meaning beyond beauty? High in the Andes, the stone city of Machu Picchu clings to mountain ridges with a precision that defies gravity and explanation. The Intihuatana stone, often called the hitching post of the sun, aligns perfectly with the solstices, casting no shadow at noon during certain times of the year. But beyond solar alignment, Machu Picchu mirrors constellations reflected in the Milky Way, which the Inca saw not as empty space, but as a celestial river filled with dark star patterns. The city is positioned as if it were a map, translating the sky onto the earth, anchoring the heavens into stone. And then there is the quiet repetition that begins to unsettle the mind. Egypt, Cambodia, Mesoamerica, South America, different gods, different languages, different mythologies, yet the same obsession with aligning sacred space to invisible points in the sky, not to the horizon, not to nearby mountains, but to things that cannot be touched, cannot be controlled, and cannot be seen during most of the day. Stars that rise once a year in a specific way, points that shift slowly over thousands of years, celestial markers that outlast dynasties. What if these alignments were not merely symbolic, but functional? What if temples were not just places of worship, but receivers, tuned to cosmic cycles, the way antennas tune to frequencies? Stone does not vibrate like metal, but geometry does something stranger. It organizes space. It focuses attention. It synchronizes human behavior with celestial events. When thousands of people gather at the same moment, at the same alignment, witnessing the same solar or stellar event framed perfectly by architecture, something happens in the collective mind. Belief solidifies. Memory anchors. Time itself feels marked, segmented, meaningful. Now consider this. Many of these alignments point not to the same stars forever, but to where those stars were thousands of years ago. Precession shifts the sky slowly, like a drifting clock face, and yet, ancient builders accounted for this. They built not for the sky they saw, but for the sky they knew was coming or had already passed. This implies long-term thinking on a scale that feels alien today. Who plans sacred architecture around celestial movements that take tens of thousands of years to complete? Who builds for observers who do not yet exist? What if the invisible sky point is not just a star or a constellation, but a reference marker in a much larger system, a cosmic coordinate, a fixed address in a universe that is otherwise in constant motion? Modern astronomy tells us that Earth moves around the sun moves through the galaxy, and the galaxy itself drifts through intergalactic space. Almost nothing is stationary. Almost nothing except certain deep space reference points used today to orient spacecraft and telescopes. Fixed points. Anchors. Is it possible that ancient civilizations, through methods we have forgotten or dismissed, identified the same anchors? That they recognized a stable reference in the chaos of the cosmos and aligned their most sacred structures to it as a way of saying, here, this is where it all lines up. If so, temples were not built to impress gods, but to remind humans of their position in something vast and ordered. The alignment itself becomes the message, not words, not myths, but orientation, direction, a way of saying that meaning does not come from looking inward alone, but from situating yourself correctly within the universe. When civilizations across the globe independently decide that the most important thing they can do is point stone toward the same invisible sky target, coincidence begins to feel inadequate as an explanation. And perhaps the most haunting thought of all is this: what if the sky point they aligned to is not important to us yet? What if it marked an event, a cycle, or a return that has not fully revealed itself? A rendezvous point in time rather than space. A reminder left behind in architecture, waiting for a future civilization capable of noticing the pattern and asking why so many ancient voices, separated by oceans and ages, were all quietly pointing upward toward the same silent place in the dark. Because messages do not always shout, sometimes they align. And sometimes, the most powerful message a civilization can leave is not what it says, but where it tells you to look. Every civilization tells stories about the past, but a strange few tell stories about the future, not the hopeful kind, not dreams of progress or golden ages, but warnings, cataclysms, resets, moments when the sky itself breaks its silence and something vast returns. What is unsettling is not that one culture imagined such an ending, but that cultures separated by oceans, continents, and thousands of years describe the same event in eerily similar ways, as if they were all remembering something that had not happened yet, or had happened before and was destined to happen again. In the frozen north, the ancient stories of the Norse civilization speak of Ragnarok, a final age where the sun darkens, stars vanish, the world tree trembles, and the sky splits open. Wolves devour the sun and moon, the seas rise and swallow the land. Fire and ice collide, not as metaphors, but as cosmic forces unleashed together. This is not a moral allegory about human behavior. It is a timeline, a sequence of physical events: darkness, celestial disruption, global collapse, renewal, and then silence, followed by rebirth. Travel thousands of miles south to Mesoamerica, where the Maya civilization encoded their warnings not just in myth, but in mathematics. Their long-count calendar does not simply track time, it measures world ages. Each age ends not gently, but violently. Floods, fire from the sky, Earth shaking itself apart. The famous cycle ending in 2012 was misunderstood as a date of doom, but the Maya never described it as an apocalypse. They described it as a reset, a turning of the cosmic wheel, the same language used in Ragnarok. Destruction not as an ending, but as a prerequisite for continuation. Cross the oceans again to the ancient river valleys of India, where Hindu cosmology describes the end of a yuga, an age marked by moral decay and cosmic imbalance. At the end comes fire from the heavens, the oceans boiling, the sun growing unbearable, and the universe collapsing inward before being reborn. The god Shiva dances the Tandava, a destruction so total that it resets existence itself. The scale is not local, it is cosmic. Stars, planets, and time itself are involved. This is not myth as fantasy. This is myth as system architecture. In the deserts of the Middle East, ancient texts from Mesopotamia speak of divine warnings delivered before a great flood. The Sumerians described a time when the gods decided to wipe the slate clean, not because humanity failed morally, but because the world itself had become unstable. Noise, imbalance, excess. The flood was not punishment, it was correction. A system reboot disguised as divine wrath. And notably, the warning always comes first. Someone is told, someone is chosen to remember. Among the Hopi people of North America, the prophecy of the blue star Kachina tells of a celestial sign that will appear before the world is purified by fire. When the blue star dances in the plaza, the elders say, "The time of the fourth world ends." The description is chillingly precise, a star that does not behave like a star, moving unnaturally, signaling a transition that humanity cannot stop, only endure. This is not a comet as metaphor. This is an object, a marker, a countdown. Even in the Pacific, far from the centers of ancient empires, Polynesian legends speak of a time when the sky falls, when the sun stands still, when the ocean rises and eats the islands, and when survivors must rebuild from fragments of memory. The same pattern emerges again and again: a celestial trigger, a global effect, a collapse of order, a rebirth into a quieter world. What is truly disturbing is not the presence of destruction myths. Humans fear death. Stories of endings are inevitable. What is disturbing is the shared structure of these warnings. First, a sign in the sky. Then, disruption of celestial bodies. Then, environmental collapse on a global scale. Then, silence. Then, renewal. This sequence appears with such consistency that it begins to resemble not imagination, but data passed through metaphor. Consider how limited ancient communication truly was. No global councils, no shared libraries, no satellites tracking cosmic events. And yet, they all agree on the same basic outline. Something comes. It comes from the sky. It affects the entire planet. It cannot be negotiated with. And it does not end humanity forever, only reshapes it. What if these myths are not predictions, but memories? What if civilizations rise after surviving fragments of a previous collapse, carrying forward distorted echoes of what happened before? Over generations, trauma becomes story. Data becomes deity. Astronomical events become gods and monsters because that is the only language capable of carrying the weight of the experience across millennia. Modern science already confirms that Earth exists in a dangerous neighborhood. Asteroid impacts, solar flares capable of stripping technology, gamma-ray bursts that could sterilize continents in seconds, supernovae close enough to alter the chemistry of the atmosphere. These are not speculative myths. These are documented cosmic threats. Yet ancient cultures, without telescopes or equations, seemed deeply aware that the sky was not passive, that it could turn hostile without warning. And perhaps the most haunting detail is this. In nearly every myth, the warning is ignored. The signs are misinterpreted. The people continue their routines. The collapse arrives not because it was sudden, but because it was underestimated. How modern that sounds. How familiar. If these stories were merely cultural inventions, we would expect variety, endless creativity, unique endings shaped by local fears. Instead, we see convergence, a shared narrative spine stretching across continents and ages, as if humanity, again and again, tried to tell itself the same thing in different voices. What if the message was never meant to be comforting? What if it was meant to persist? Stone erodes, languages die, but fear encoded into myth survives. It is retold to children, it is ritualized, it is sung, it becomes part of identity, a warning system that does not require technology to function. And maybe the reason these myths feel so urgent now is not because we are imagining danger, but because we are finally capable of recognizing the pattern they were pointing to. We watch the sky with instruments they could not dream of. We track near-Earth objects. We map solar storms. We calculate probabilities of extinction-level events. And slowly, uncomfortably, we realize that the ancient warnings do not contradict science. They rhyme with it. What if every civilization did leave us a message, not carved into stone or aligned into temples, but woven into stories designed to survive ignorance, superstition, and time itself? What if the message was simple and terrifying? The sky is not empty, the universe is not gentle, and history does not move in a straight line? Because if myths from every continent are all pointing toward the same kind of future, then the real question is not whether they were right. The real question is whether we will recognize the warning before it becomes memory again. There is a moment that comes when you stop looking at ancient monuments as isolated achievements and begin to see them as equations written in stone, not metaphors, not poetic exaggerations. Actual numbers, ratios, and constants repeating with such stubborn consistency that coincidence starts to feel mathematically irresponsible. These builders did not just stack rocks, they encoded relationships. They carved proportions that refuse to disappear. Even when cultures collapse, languages vanish, and names turn to dust. Stand before the Great Pyramid, and the first shock is scale. The second shock is precision. The perimeter divided by twice the height produces a number astonishingly close to pi, the same constant that governs circles, waves, planetary orbits, and the curvature of space itself. This is not a hidden trick you only see if you want to believe. It is measurable, repeatable, real. Pi is not a cultural idea. It is a universal property of reality. And somehow, it appears in a monument built thousands of years before calculus existed, before the decimal system, before formal mathematics as we understand it today. Now, step back and ask the uncomfortable question. Why would a civilization embed a circular constant into a square-based structure? Why express the language of curves inside straight stone? Because pi is not just about circles. It is about cycles, about repetition, about the relationship between linear distance and curved motion. It governs waves, oscillations, rotations, and time itself. Encoding pi into a monument is not decorative. It is declarative. It is a statement that the builders understood something fundamental about how reality loops back on itself. Then, there is the golden ratio, a number that appears when growth balances itself perfectly, when expansion does not collapse into chaos. This ratio governs the spirals of galaxies, the arrangement of leaves, the proportions of the human body. And it appears again and again in ancient architecture, in the dimensions of temples, in the spacing of columns, in the proportions of staircases and sanctuaries. Structures feel harmonious not because of aesthetic intuition alone, but because they are mathematically aligned with how nature organizes complexity without falling apart. In Mesoamerican pyramids, the step heights, terrace widths, and overall proportions repeatedly resolve into the same ratios found in Egyptian and Mesopotamian construction. Different materials, different gods, different continents, same math. This is where the story becomes unsettling. Mathematics is not inherited through myth easily. You cannot accidentally rediscover the same constants across civilizations unless you are measuring the same thing. And what they were measuring was not land, it was the universe. Look at Stonehenge, often dismissed as primitive, and you find sophisticated geometry encoded into its ring, spacing, and sight lines. The diameter ratios align with lunar and solar cycles that require generations of observation to calculate accurately. These are not farmers' guesses. These are long-term datasets translated into stone, numbers turned into architecture so they could survive human forgetfulness. In the Indus Valley, bricks were manufactured with standardized ratios across cities separated by hundreds of miles, not approximate, identical. A ratio of length, width, and height that remains consistent everywhere. This suggests not just engineering discipline, but shared mathematical doctrine, a belief that proportion mattered beyond utility, that certain ratios were correct, not merely convenient. What is most disturbing is that many of these constants are irrational numbers. They never resolve. They never end. Their decimals stretch into infinity without repeating. These are not numbers you stumble upon casually. They represent relationships that cannot be fully expressed, only approximated. Why would ancient builders obsess over numbers that can never be finished? Unless the point was not completion, but alignment. Not ownership of knowledge, but participation in something larger. Think about what it means to encode an irrational constant into a monument. You are saying that reality itself is infinite, that truth cannot be fully contained, that approximation is enough to point in the right direction. This is not primitive thinking. This is philosophical maturity expressed through mathematics. Even the layout of ancient cities often follows modular ratios that scale up and down while preserving proportion. Streets, plazas, temples, and boundaries mirror each other at different sizes. Like fractals before fractal geometry had a name, the same pattern repeated at multiple scales, from a doorway to a city plan. This mirrors how nature operates. Coastlines, blood vessels, cloud formations, growth without loss of structure. And then comes the realization that these constants are not just embedded once, but layered. A single monument may encode multiple ratios simultaneously. Pi and its perimeter, the golden ratio and its height relationships, harmonic numbers in its spacing, astronomical cycles in its orientation. This is not accidental overlap. This is compression, information layered into form, so that even if one meaning is lost, another survives. Why do this? Because numbers do not rely on language. A myth can be misinterpreted. A symbol can change meaning. But a ratio remains true no matter who measures it. Mathematics is the closest thing humanity has to a universal language. Any intelligent being capable of measurement can recognize pi. Any observer can find the golden ratio. If you wanted to leave a message that could survive cultural extinction, mathematics would be the safest medium. And perhaps that is the point. These monuments may not be messages to future humans alone. They may be beacons to any intelligence capable of recognizing mathematical relationships. a way of saying, we understood this much. We saw the structure beneath appearances. We noticed that the universe runs on numbers, not chaos. Modern science now confirms what these builders seem to intuit. The universe is written in mathematics. Physical constants govern everything from particle interactions to galactic formation. Change the numbers slightly, and reality collapses. Fine-tuning is not poetic language, it is literal. And ancient monuments appear obsessed with this idea long before equations existed to describe it. What if these structures were not expressions of power or worship, but acknowledgments of constraint? A recognition that civilizations rise and fall, but the constants do not change. Dynasties end. Gods are replaced, empires vanish. But pi remains pi. Ratios remain ratios. The universe does not negotiate, and there is something humbling in that. These builders may have known they would be forgotten, that their names would erode, that their stories would fragment. But they trusted that the numbers would still be there, waiting for someone, someday, to notice. When we measure these monuments today and find the same constant staring back at us, we are not discovering their secrets. We are confirming their awareness. We are standing where they stood, recognizing the same relationships, participating in the same mathematical reality. The message does not say who they were. It says what is real. And maybe the most unsettling possibility of all is this. What if these constants were not just observations, but warnings, reminders that reality has limits, ratios that must be respected, thresholds that cannot be crossed without consequence? If civilizations ignore the mathematics of balance, of growth, of cycles, collapse is not moral. It is inevitable, because numbers do not forgive. They do not care who you worship or what you believe. They only describe what is. And carved into monuments across the world, repeating with quiet insistence, is a message humanity keeps rediscovering far too late. The universe runs on constants, and every ancient monument seems to be whispering the same thing across time. We saw them too. Listen carefully to how humans speak, and something strange begins to surface. Strip away the sounds, the accents, the scripts carved into stone or written on paper, and what remains is a skeletal structure that feels eerily familiar. Subject and action, past and future. Questions shaped the same way. Negation marked in similar places. Hierarchies of meaning nested inside one another like Russian dolls. Languages born on opposite sides of the planet, separated by oceans, ice ages, and tens of thousands of years, somehow follow the same invisible rules. Not borrowed, not taught, simply there. The traditional explanation says this is coincidence, or biology, or practicality. That the human brain can only organize information in certain ways, so languages naturally converge on similar structures. But that explanation begins to crack when you look closer, not at vocabulary, but at grammar itself. Grammar is not decoration, it is architecture. It is how thought is assembled before it becomes sound. And the architecture looks uncannily shared. Take ancient Sumerian, one of the earliest written languages we know. It uses agglutination, stacking small meaning units together to build complex ideas. Now jump thousands of miles and millennia forward to languages spoken by indigenous peoples of the Americas who had no contact with Mesopotamia. You find the same stacking behavior, meaning blocks arranged in predictable orders, tense markers, agency markers, evidential markers indicating how the speaker knows something. These are not obvious necessities, they are design choices. In the ancient language of the Sumerians, verbs change based on whether an action is completed or ongoing, whether it is intentional or accidental. Now listen to classical Mayan languages and you find the same deep concern with aspect rather than simple tense. Not just when something happened, but how it unfolded. This is not a universal survival requirement. Many languages could function without it. Yet it appears again and again, as if human cognition insists on encoding reality this way. Even more unsettling is the presence of recursion, the ability to nest ideas within ideas, a sentence inside a sentence inside a sentence. The man who saw the bird that flew from the tree that stood on the hill. This structure appears in languages across the globe, no contact, no shared origin stories, and yet, the same mental loop. Recursion is powerful, but it is not inevitable. Artificial languages often struggle to implement it naturally, and yet humans do it instinctively. everywhere. Why would isolated cultures converge on the same deep grammatical tools unless they were responding to the same underlying pressure? Not environmental, not cultural, but cognitive, or perhaps something even deeper. Consider how languages mark questions: rising intonation, front-loading question words, special particles that flip certainty into uncertainty. This appears in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe. The surface sounds differ, but the logic is the same, as if the human mind requires a consistent way to signal doubt, curiosity, and the act of reaching beyond known information. The structure of inquiry itself seems hard-coded. Then there is the hierarchy of meaning: nouns modified by adjectives, verbs modified by adverbs, clauses embedded inside clauses. This tree-like structure mirrors how the brain organizes perception: objects, attributes, actions, context. It also mirrors how computer languages are structured, how mathematics nests functions, how DNA encodes instructions inside instructions. The resemblance is uncomfortable. Some linguists call this universal grammar, an inherited framework that constrains how languages can form. But that only pushes the question back one step. Why would such a framework exist at all? Why would evolution select for a specific abstract structure of thought rather than letting languages sprawl chaotically? Survival does not require elegance, it requires adequacy. Yet, language is elegant, economical, efficient in ways that feel intentional. Even writing systems, invented independently, show strange convergence: syllabaries, alphabets, logograms. These appear again and again. Humans either break sound into units or meaning into symbols. Very few systems escape this binary. Why? Because the brain itself seems to process language in these chunks, as if there is a preferred resolution for meaning, a pixel size for thought. The deeper you go, the more it feels like languages are not invented so much as discovered, as if they are different surface expressions of the same underlying operating system. Different skins, same code base. And then comes the most unsettling observation of all. Children everywhere acquire language in the same stages: babbling, single words, two-word constructions, grammatical explosions, errors that follow the same patterns across cultures. Children say "goed" instead of "went," not because they were taught wrong, but because their brains are applying internal rules. Rules they were never explicitly given, rules that seem to exist before experience. This suggests that language structure is not learned from scratch. It is activated, like software already present, waiting for input. The environment does not write the code, it triggers it. Now widen the lens. If every civilization left messages in stone, symbols, and myths, what if language itself is part of that message? What if the shared structure of human language is not an accident of biology, but a constraint placed on cognition itself? A way to ensure that certain concepts can always be expressed, no matter how cultures diverge. Think about what languages universally allow. They allow reference to the past and future. They allow negation. They allow hypothetical worlds. If this had happened, then that would have followed. This is not trivial. This is counterfactual thinking. The ability to imagine realities that do not exist. This is the foundation of planning, ethics, science, and regret. Why would evolution insist on this capacity everywhere, in every human group, unless it served a purpose beyond immediate survival? Some researchers suggest that language evolved to model reality accurately. But language does not just model reality, it models possibilities. It allows humans to simulate outcomes internally before acting. In other words, it turns the mind into a prediction engine, and prediction is power. What if the shared structure of language is a survival mechanism on a civilizational timescale, not an individual one? A way to ensure that no matter how many times humanity resets, fragments, or scatters, it will always be able to reconstruct complex thought, science, and self-awareness using the same underlying grammar. Imagine a future collapse. Libraries burn, digital records vanish, knowledge resets to oral tradition. What remains? Language. And embedded inside language are the tools to rebuild everything else: mathematics, logic, story, warning, memory, all encoded into grammar itself. And then there is a more unsettling possibility. What if language is not just for communication between humans, but a compatibility layer for something else? a way to ensure that human cognition remains interpretable. That meaning can be extracted, compared, translated, and understood across time and even intelligence types. Mathematics is often called the universal language, but mathematics alone cannot convey experience, fear, warning, or value. Language can, and its shared structure ensures that these concepts are never completely lost. When we see languages sharing deep architecture despite no contact, we are not witnessing coincidence, we are seeing constraint. The same way physical constants constrain the universe, cognitive constants may constrain thought, and those constraints may themselves be the message, not carved into stone, not aligned to stars, but built into the very way we think and speak, a silent inheritance that every human receives at birth, regardless of culture, creed, or continent. If every civilization left a message, perhaps the most profound one was not external at all. Perhaps it was internal. A structure embedded so deeply that it could not be erased by fire, flood, or forgetting. Because as long as humans speak, they will think in patterns. And as long as they think in patterns, they will be capable of recognizing patterns left behind by those who came before. And maybe that was the point all along. There are moments in archaeology when an object is lifted from the ground and immediately feels wrong, not broken or damaged, but misplaced in time. Not because it is old, but because it does not fit anywhere in the story we tell ourselves about how human knowledge is supposed to progress. These are the artifacts that refuse classification. Tablets that are not fully pictographic, yet not phonetic. Inscriptions that blend symbol, sound, number, and geometry into a single surface. Writing systems that appear fully formed, deliberately structured, and then never used again. In Mesopotamia, alongside the familiar wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform, archaeologists have uncovered tablets bearing marks that resemble neither pure pictographs nor standard phonetic signs. Some symbols resemble abstract diagrams rather than words. Others look like mathematical operators embedded into text. These hybrid inscriptions do not repeat enough to form a known language. They do not evolve into later scripts. They appear once, briefly, and then vanish, like a prototype abandoned mid-experiment by the Sumerians themselves. In the Indus Valley, the mystery deepens. Thousands of seals have been recovered, each bearing short strings of symbols that resist every attempt at decipherment. What is unsettling is not just that we cannot read them, but that they do not behave like a normal script. The symbol sequences are too short for storytelling, too structured to be decoration, and too consistent to be random. Some symbols resemble pictograms. Others resemble abstract strokes. Some look numerical. Yet, no long texts exist. No evolution toward a spoken language transcription ever appears. It is as if the system was never meant to be read aloud. Then there are the Rongorongo tablets of Easter Island, wooden boards covered in glyphs that seem to combine human figures, animals, celestial shapes, and repeating geometric forms. The writing direction itself reverses with each line, a style known as reverse boustrophedon, so rare that it feels intentionally obscure. The glyphs are neither purely symbolic nor phonetic. They behave like compressed data, repeating clusters, paired elements, symmetry that suggests logic rather than narrative. And again, no descendants, no transitional scripts. Just a system that appears, exists briefly, and disappears. In China, oracle bone inscriptions show a similar anomaly. Alongside early characters that would eventually evolve into Chinese writing, there exist marks that never make the transition, symbols that resemble flowcharts more than words, combinations that imply process rather than description, as if multiple writing paradigms were tested simultaneously, and only one was selected to survive. Even in Europe, on artifacts like the Phaistos disc from Crete, we find a spiral of stamped symbols that look mass-produced, standardized, and carefully arranged. The symbols do not match any known writing system. They appear both pictorial and abstract, suggesting sound, meaning, and pattern at the same time. The disc remains unique, no duplicates, no evolution. A single object that feels less like a message and more like a demonstration. This pattern repeats too often to ignore. Hybrid writing systems appear fully conceptualized, then vanish without lineage. That is not how human technology usually behaves. Tools evolve, writing systems simplify, alphabets emerge from complexity, but these scripts do the opposite. They appear sophisticated from the start and then leave no descendants. Why would a civilization invest time, resources, and intellectual effort into developing a writing system and then abandon it entirely? One possibility is that these systems were not meant for daily communication. Writing as we understand it serves trade, administration, storytelling, law. But these hybrid scripts do not fit those purposes. They are inefficient for speech transcription. They are difficult to carve repeatedly. They do not scale easily, which raises an unsettling possibility. What if they were not meant to encode speech at all? Consider how modern humans store information when longevity matters more than readability. We use diagrams, schematics, mathematical notation, code, DNA storage. These systems are not designed to be read aloud. They are designed to preserve relationships, processes, and instructions across time. Hybrid writing systems look less like language and more like interfaces. Some symbols appear consistently across unrelated artifacts: crosses, forked lines, boxes containing marks, repeating trios. These resemble logical operators, conditional markers, flow states. They look eerily similar to the way modern programming languages represent decisions, loops, and states, not in syntax, but in structure. What if these scripts were not abandoned because they failed, but because they succeeded too well at a purpose we no longer recognize? What if they encoded knowledge that was not meant to be widespread, but preserved? Knowledge that could not be trusted to oral tradition, yet was too dangerous, complex, or disruptive to integrate into everyday society. Another possibility is even more unsettling. What if these systems were not designed for humans to read easily? Human language evolved for mouths and ears, but these scripts seem optimized for eyes and pattern recognition, for scanning rather than sounding out, for recognition rather than narration, almost as if they were meant to be interpreted by minds trained differently, or by future minds with different tools. We already know that some ancient knowledge was deliberately restricted. Priest classes, initiation rituals, forbidden texts, sacred geometry taught only to select individuals. Hybrid scripts could represent a tier of information above myth, but below technology. A compression layer, storing complex ideas in minimal space, resistant to corruption, resistant to translation, waiting for the right cognitive framework to unlock them. There is also the troubling fact that many of these artifacts appear during periods of transition, the rise or fall of civilizations, times of collapse, climate stress, social upheaval, moments when knowledge continuity is threatened. In such moments, a civilization might attempt to preserve its most critical understanding in a form that could survive destruction, even if it could not be immediately understood. Stone tablets crack, paper burns, oral stories mutate, but abstract symbols, if designed correctly, can persist as puzzles rather than texts. They survive by being unreadable. Curiosity keeps them alive when comprehension fails. Think about how we send messages into space today. We use diagrams, binary sequences, mathematical constants, not English, not Mandarin. Because we know language is fragile, but relationships are not. A ratio is always a ratio. A pattern remains a pattern. Hybrid writing systems feel like early versions of that impulse, a way to say something important without tying it to a specific tongue or culture, a way to future-proof meaning. And then there is the most uncomfortable question of all. What if these systems were never meant to be completed? What if they were deliberately left unfinished or unadopted because their purpose was fulfilled the moment they were created? A signal, not a library. A proof of concept. A marker that says, this level of understanding was reached here. Modern archaeology treats writing as a linear progression toward efficiency, but these artifacts suggest branching paths, experiments that were not pursued, choices made to simplify, to forget, to narrow what could be expressed easily. Perhaps alphabets won because they democratized communication, but in doing so, they may have sacrificed something else: the ability to encode layered meaning compactly, the ability to store process instead of story. When we hold these artifacts today and admit we cannot read them, the failure may not be theirs, it may be ours. We are trying to approach them as languages when they may be closer to systems. interfaces, compression schemes. If every civilization left a message, these hybrid scripts may be among the most honest attempts. Not myths softened by metaphor, not monuments eroded by time, but raw attempts to freeze understanding in a form that could outlast collapse. They were never meant to be used daily. They were meant to endure. And perhaps the reason they feel so alien now is because they were designed for a future that had not arrived yet. A future with pattern recognition tools, with mathematics mature enough to see structure where earlier minds saw only marks. A future like ours. The ground keeps giving them back to us again and again, as if insisting we look harder. As if saying, this was not decoration. This was not art. This was not failure. This was a message that chose patience over clarity, and it is still waiting. Before alphabets hardened into rules, before grammar froze into textbooks, before writing learned how to sound like speech, there may have been something else, something quieter, something shared. A way of communicating that did not belong to any one culture, because it existed before culture fragmented into names, borders, and myths. Evidence of it does not appear as sentences or stories. It appears as structure, as pattern, as repetition so ancient and so widespread that it feels less like invention and more like inheritance. When archaeologists uncover the earliest marks humans left behind, they do not find words. They find dots, lines, handprints, spirals, crosshatched grids, repeating sequences carved into bone, stone, and cave walls tens of thousands of years before recorded history begins. These markings appear in Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, and the Americas, created by groups with no possible contact. And yet, the symbols recur. The same abstract forms, the same visual grammar, the same insistence on repetition and placement. At sites like Göbekli Tepe, massive stone pillars were erected more than 11,000 years ago, before agriculture, before cities, before writing as we define it. Carved into these pillars are animals, abstract signs, and repeated motifs arranged with deliberate symmetry. There is no narrative scene, no obvious storytelling. Instead, there is syntax. Placement matters. Orientation matters. The symbols relate to each other spatially, as if meaning emerges not from sound, but from arrangement. Long before cuneiform or hieroglyphs, humans were already externalizing thought, but they were not transcribing speech. They were encoding relationships. Across Paleolithic caves in France and Spain, the same geometric signs appear again and again. Claviforms, dots, zigzags, ladders, and branching lines. These are not random doodles. Statistical analysis shows that these symbols were used consistently in specific contexts over tens of thousands of years. This implies shared understanding across generations, a symbolic system that endured far longer than most civilizations ever have. What kind of language survives unchanged for 30,000 years? Not a spoken one. Spoken language evolves too fast. Sounds drift. Meanings shift. But visual structure endures. A spiral still communicates cycle. A cross still implies intersection. A line of dots still suggests counting, sequence, or passage. Even more unsettling is that these early symbols often appear alongside representations of animals, celestial patterns, and hunting scenes, as if the abstract signs were commenting on reality rather than depicting it. Not nouns, but operators. Not names, but logic. In Africa, ochre engravings from Blombos Cave show deliberate geometric patterns dating back over 70,000 years. Parallel lines, cross-hatching, rhythmic spacing. These are not utilitarian marks. They serve no obvious practical purpose. They exist to be seen, recognized, and perhaps understood. The human mind was externalizing pattern long before it learned to record speech. Now consider the fact that early writing systems did not emerge independently from scratch. They emerged from proto-writing, from symbol sets that already existed, already carried meaning without phonetics. Sumerian cuneiform began as accounting marks. Egyptian hieroglyphs began as images tied to concepts. Chinese characters evolved from pictorial signs. In every case, writing grows out of a pre-existing symbolic substrate. That substrate may be the echo of a universal language, a language not spoken with the mouth, but perceived with the nervous system, one that relies on spatial relationships, repetition, rhythm, symmetry, and contrast. A language of cognition rather than culture. Even infants respond to this language. Long before they understand words, they recognize patterns. Repetition calms them. Symmetry attracts attention. Rhythm conveys expectation. These are not learned responses, they are built in. The brain is a pattern recognition machine before it is a language processor. What if early humans exploited this shared cognitive wiring? What if the first universal language was not vocal, but visual and structural, designed to be understood intuitively by any human mind, regardless of tribe or tongue? Consider how mathematics functions today. A mathematical equation written in one country can be understood in another without translation. Numbers do not care about accent. Geometry does not require grammar. A triangle communicates itself instantly. A ratio conveys balance without explanation. This is why mathematics is used to communicate with machines and why it is proposed as the language to contact extraterrestrial intelligence. But mathematics did not appear suddenly. It evolved from counting marks, from tallies, from spatial grouping, from dots carved into bone, from lines scratched into stone. These early marks may not represent numbers in the modern sense, but they represent order, quantity, sequence, relationship, the same foundations upon which mathematics would later be built. And then there is the curious fact that myths, symbols, language structure, and monument design all seem to converge on the same themes: cycles, balance, alignment, ascent, return. These ideas appear before writing and persist long after. They are not bound to vocabulary. They are bound to cognition. A universal language does not need words if the message is structural, if it teaches how to see rather than what to say. This may explain why so many ancient symbols resist direct translation. We keep trying to read them as text when they may be closer to diagrams, instructions for perception. Cognitive tools rather than messages. Think about how a map works. A map does not describe terrain in sentences. It uses symbols, scale, orientation, and relative position. Anyone who understands the conventions can read it, regardless of language. Now, imagine a map not of land, but of reality itself, of time, of cycles, of human experience. Such a map would not need words. It would need consistency. And consistency is exactly what we find, across continents, across epochs, across cultures that never met. There is also the troubling possibility that this universal language predates modern humans themselves, that it may have been inherited, refined, and passed down from earlier hominin cultures. Knowledge carried forward not through stories, but through marks that outlived memory. A continuity of cognition rather than civilization. Modern neuroscience suggests that the human brain processes visual spatial information faster and more reliably than language. Words require decoding. Symbols are recognized. Patterns are felt. This suggests that the earliest form of communication aimed at permanence would naturally favor structure over sound. And permanence seems to have mattered deeply. Why else carve symbols into cave walls where no one lived? Why place marks deep underground, far from daily life? Why align symbols with seasonal light, animal migration, or celestial cycles? These were not casual expressions. They were acts of preservation. If you wanted to leave a message that could survive collapse, flood, migration, and forgetting, you would not rely on spoken language. You would rely on pattern. Perhaps the universal language was not a single script, but a shared cognitive framework, a way of encoding meaning that could be rediscovered again and again, even if its original context was lost. This would explain why later civilizations independently reinvented similar symbols, similar myths, similar structures. They were not copying each other. They were rediscovering the same underlying template, like multiple programmers independently writing similar code to solve the same problem. The problem, in this case, may have been survival, continuity, the need to transmit something essential across time, not generations, but epochs. And maybe that something was not practical knowledge like farming or toolmaking, but existential knowledge, an understanding of cycles, of collapse and renewal. of humanity's place in a vast, indifferent universe. A spoken warning can be ignored. A written law can be erased. But a pattern embedded into cognition itself cannot be destroyed without destroying the species. If evidence of a universal language exists before recorded history, it may not appear as a dictionary or a Rosetta Stone. It appears as convergence, as repetition, as the same ideas emerging wherever humans reach a certain level of awareness. We are still speaking fragments of it today, in mathematics, in music, in architecture, in art, in code, in the way we instinctively organize information. The oldest language may never have been lost. It may simply have been forgotten as a language. And now, as we uncover these artifacts, measure these patterns, and notice these recurrences, we may not be deciphering an ancient message so much as remembering how to read, because the message was never meant to be heard. It was meant to be recognized. There is something uniquely unsettling about a prophecy that refuses to stay in the past. Ancient warnings usually age into metaphor, safely distant, softened by time, but a different category of prophecy exists, one that does not dissolve as centuries pass. Instead, it sharpens. It points forward, not to an era, not to a vague age, but to a specific window of time that has not yet arrived, a year that still waits ahead of us, like a quiet marker on the road. Across continents, civilizations with no shared calendars, no synchronized clocks, and no contact at all left behind calculations, cycles, and countdowns that converge on future dates rather than ancient ones. This alone should give us pause. Predicting the past is easy. Predicting the future requires confidence in a structure of time itself. In Mesoamerica, the long count calendar of the Maya civilization is often misunderstood as mystical or symbolic. In reality, it is brutally mathematical. It tracks time in units so large they dwarf human history. Baktuns, Katuns, cycles nested inside cycles, all rolling forward like gears in a cosmic machine. When one great cycle ended in 2012, modern culture panicked, expecting catastrophe. But the Maya never described it that way. They described it as a rollover, like an odometer turning over after reaching its limit. Not the end, but a transition. What matters is not that 2012 passed quietly. What matters is that the calendar continues beyond it. And within those extended counts, certain dates recur as thresholds, moments when cycles align, moments when previous ages are said to echo. The Maya were not predicting doom. They were identifying pressure points in time, moments when the structure of reality itself becomes unstable, or at least receptive to change. In ancient India, Hindu cosmology describes yugas, vast ages lasting hundreds of thousands to millions of years. We are said to be living in the Kali Yuga, the age of decline, confusion, and accelerated decay. What is often overlooked is that ancient texts do not treat the Yuga transitions as purely symbolic. They give durations, calculations, ratios, and when scholars translate those cycles into modern astronomical timekeeping, some of the transition points land disturbingly close to the same future centuries highlighted in other traditions. These are not exact matches down to a single calendar year, but they do not need to be. Ancient timekeeping was never about precision the way modern clocks are. It was about alignment, overlap, convergence. When multiple long cycles approach their inflection points at the same time, something changes, not suddenly, but irreversibly. In Europe, medieval prophecies attributed to figures like Nostradamus are often dismissed as vague poetry, and much of it is. But buried among the metaphors are references to periods rather than events, times when the great cycle completes, when the old order dissolves, when fire from the sky returns. These phrases are not tied to kings or wars, they are tied to eras, and some of his calculated windows extend well beyond his own lifetime, landing in centuries he would never see. In Islamic eschatology, certain hadiths speak of signs that unfold in sequence, accelerating as time compresses toward a final threshold. Not a sudden end, but a period where events cluster unnaturally close together. Knowledge exploding, moral confusion, environmental imbalance, celestial signs. What is striking is not the theology, but the pattern recognition. Time itself is described as behaving differently near the end of a cycle, as if the system is running out of room. In ancient Persia, Zoroastrian cosmology describes world ages culminating in a final renovation of existence. Each age lasts a defined span. Each decline accelerates toward renewal. The final age is marked not by annihilation, but by exposure. Hidden things revealed. Fire as purifier, not destroyer. Truth separating from illusion. Again, not an apocalypse, but a correction. Even among indigenous traditions with no written records, prophecies often reference generational counts rather than abstract futures. The Hopi speak of world ages ending when specific signs appear, one of which is a gourd of ashes falling from the sky, another a web spread across the earth. These are often interpreted metaphorically today, but the structure of the prophecy is chronological. The signs accumulate. The threshold is crossed. A new world begins. What begins to emerge is not agreement on an event, but agreement on timing behavior. Time is cyclical, but cycles are not smooth. They have nodes, stress points, years or decades where change accelerates beyond expectation. Modern science, ironically, is beginning to describe time in similar ways. Climate systems exhibit tipping points. Once crossed, feedback loops accelerate change rapidly. Technological growth follows exponential curves, compressing centuries of progress into decades. Astrophysics identifies periodic cosmic hazards. Asteroid clusters, solar cycles, galactic plane crossings. These are not evenly distributed, they cluster. We are entering a century dense with convergences. Technological singularities predicted by computer science. Climate thresholds identified by physics. Astronomical cycles reaching peaks. Demographic and ecological stress points aligning globally for the first time in history. This alone does not validate prophecy, but it does explain why ancient thinkers, tracking long arcs of time, might have identified the same regions of instability. The most unsettling part is that many prophecies do not describe a single catastrophic moment. They describe a window, a span of years where choices matter more than outcomes, where systems can either collapse chaotically or reorganize intentionally. A fork, not a finish line. Why point to a future year at all? Why not simply warn of decline? Because a date anchors attention. It resists erosion. It invites recalculation. It forces future generations to ask, why here? Even if the exact year shifts slightly due to calendar drift, the intent survives. Look here. Watch this period. If these prophecies were fabrications, we would expect them to cluster around the author's lifetimes, serving political or religious agendas. Instead, many point far beyond their creator's influence, beyond memory, beyond reward. That suggests a different motive, preservation, not control. It is also worth noting what these prophecies rarely say. They do not focus on specific nations winning or losing. They do not glorify conquest. They do not describe technological details. They describe human behavior under pressure. Fear, division, awakening, choice. As if the external event matters less than how humanity responds to it. Perhaps the prophecies are not predictions of fate, but stress tests. Models of what happens when cycles converge. Ancient simulations expressed through story rather than code. If every civilization left a message, pointing to a future year may have been the only way to ensure that message stayed alive. Dates provoke obsession. They force recalculation. They resist dismissal. And maybe the reason so many of these dates now sit uncomfortably close to our present is not because the ancients were clairvoyant, but because they understood cycles better than we do. They watched the sky for thousands of years. They tracked rise and fall not as moral tales, but as patterns. They noticed that collapse rarely arrives without warning. It arrives when multiple systems strain at once. We are living in such a convergence now. Whether it resolves into collapse or transformation remains undecided. The prophecies do not say what will happen. They say when attention must sharpen. A message carved into time itself. Not a sentence, not a command, a reminder. Look closely now. Because this is the part of the cycle where civilizations either remember what they were trying to tell the future or become another warning for those who come after. There is a quieter layer of history that rarely makes it into textbooks, a layer where knowledge does not disappear through accident or decay, but is actively withheld, not burned, not lost, protected. Locked behind rituals, oaths, councils, and walls that were never meant to fall. When you trace this layer across the world, an uncomfortable pattern emerges. Vastly different cultures, separated by geography and belief, all formed inner circles tasked with guarding texts the public was never meant to read. In the ancient Mediterranean world, knowledge was not free, it was tiered. In Egypt, sacred texts were divided into those meant for the people and those reserved for the initiated. The so-called House of Life was not a library in the modern sense, but a controlled environment where priests trained for decades before being allowed to see certain writings. These were not hymns or prayers, they were cosmological texts, star lists, calculations of time cycles, descriptions of the soul's journey, and instructions said to be dangerous if misunderstood. Knowledge was treated like a volatile substance. Exposure without preparation was believed to cause madness, imbalance, or social collapse. Centuries later, this same pattern appears again in Europe, embedded deeply within the structure of the Church. Within the Vatican exists an archive so restricted that even many high-ranking clergy will never see its contents. The official explanation is preservation, fragility, order. But the existence of councils whose sole function is to decide who may access which texts tells a different story. Councils do not form around harmless material. They form around things that challenge stability. Throughout history, ecumenical councils met not just to define doctrine, but to exclude ideas. Texts were labeled heretical not always because they were false, but because they were disruptive. Gnostic writings, for example, presented a radically different cosmology, one where the material world was flawed, where divine knowledge was hidden, where awakening came from insight rather than obedience. These texts were not destroyed completely. Many were buried, hidden, sealed away, because destroying knowledge leaves no record. Hiding it preserves control. In the Islamic world, a similar structure emerged. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad is remembered as a beacon of learning, but alongside its openness existed restricted circles of scholars who handled texts on cosmology, alchemy, and the nature of time itself. Certain manuscripts were not copied widely, not translated for the masses. They were discussed quietly, debated cautiously, and passed hand to hand under supervision. Knowledge that altered one's understanding of reality was treated differently than knowledge that built bridges or cured disease. In India, ancient councils of Brahmins preserved the Vedas and Upanishads through oral transmission with near-obsessive precision. But not everyone was allowed to hear them. Some verses were forbidden entirely to outsiders. Others were taught only after years of moral and mental training. This was not simply social hierarchy. It was risk management. The belief was clear. Some knowledge destabilizes the unprepared mind. Some truths unravel social order if released without context. China followed a similar path. Imperial archives held texts that common scholars could never access. Dynasties rose and fell, but certain writings remained sealed, copied only under direct authorization. When emperors ordered book burnings, not everything burned. Select texts were preserved in secret, protected by councils whose loyalty was to continuity, not to the public. Knowledge was curated, not erased. Even among indigenous cultures without written language, councils of elders guarded stories that were never told openly. Some myths were seasonal, some were revealed only after initiation. Some were spoken once in a lifetime, then never repeated. These were not entertainment. They were frameworks for understanding existence, responsibility, and catastrophe. Knowledge was power, and power without restraint was considered dangerous. Why does this pattern repeat so consistently? Why do cultures that never met all arrive at the same conclusion, that certain texts must be protected from the general population? The easy answer is control, elites hoarding power. And that explanation is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Control alone does not require preservation. You can destroy threatening ideas and rule through ignorance. Preservation implies foresight. It implies that the knowledge may be needed again. Not now. Not by everyone. But someday. What kind of information would be dangerous enough to hide, yet valuable enough to protect for thousands of years? Consider what these undisclosed texts often concern. Not mundane matters. They focus on origins, on cycles of time, on the nature of consciousness, on humanity's place in the cosmos, on events that repeat, civilizations that rise and fall, and forces beyond human control. These are not comforting topics. They destabilize identity. They weaken blind loyalty. They encourage questioning not just authority, but reality itself. A population convinced that history moves in straight lines is easier to govern than one that understands cycles. A society that believes collapse is impossible is easier to control than one that knows it is inevitable. Knowledge of repetition, of resets, of cosmic indifference changes how people live, plan, and obey. Now consider the councils themselves. They often form during periods of crisis, after collapses, after wars, after revelations that fractured belief systems. Councils do not just protect texts, they decide narratives. They choose which version of reality becomes official, which stories are safe, which are postponed indefinitely. Postponed, not denied. This is the key distinction. Truly dangerous falsehoods are erased. Dangerous truths are delayed. Throughout history, we see moments where suppressed texts resurface at exactly the wrong time. The rediscovery of classical philosophy destabilized medieval Europe. The recovery of ancient astronomical texts shattered geocentric models. The unearthing of forbidden religious writings fractured unified doctrines. Each time, councils resisted, then adapted, then rewrote their authority around the new reality. This suggests that the guardians of knowledge are not omnipotent villains, but reluctant stewards. They may believe, sincerely, that humanity must mature before certain truths can be safely integrated, that releasing everything at once would cause panic, nihilism, or social collapse. And yet, the pattern remains unsettling, because who decides when humanity is ready? Who defines readiness? Who benefits from delay? If every civilization left a message, undisclosed texts may represent the rawest form of that message, unfiltered, unsoftened by myth, too direct to be shared openly, too important to destroy. Imagine a text that describes not just one apocalypse, but many, a record showing that civilizations have risen and fallen repeatedly, guided by forces beyond politics or morality. Imagine a text that describes humanity not as a unique endpoint, but as a recurring phase. Imagine how that knowledge would affect obedience, ambition, and fear. Or imagine texts that describe consciousness as something non-local, something not bound to bodies or lifetimes. Such ideas undermine fear-based control more effectively than any rebellion. If death is not final, if identity is not fixed, if reality is layered, then power structures built on scarcity and fear weaken. These are not comforting thoughts for rulers, whether kings, priests, or councils. Now place yourself in their position. You inherit fragments of knowledge that survived collapse. You know what happened last time. You know how belief systems shattered. You know how panic spread. You believe, perhaps sincerely, that releasing this information prematurely could accelerate disaster rather than prevent it. So you protect it, you delay it, you wrap it in ritual and restriction. From that perspective, councils are not villains. They are gatekeepers standing between humanity and truths that arrive before readiness. But readiness cannot be delayed forever. The modern world is different. Information spreads uncontrollably. Secrets surface. Archives leak. Manuscripts are digitized. Patterns emerge faster than they can be suppressed. We are connecting dots that once required lifetimes of study. And we are doing it collectively without councils, without permission. This may be why interest in ancient texts, forbidden knowledge, and suppressed histories is exploding now. Not because humanity is becoming reckless, but because the conditions that once justified secrecy are eroding. If there are undisclosed ancient texts still protected by councils today, their greatest fear may not be rebellion, it may be redundancy, that the message they guard is already being rediscovered independently through science, archaeology, and pattern recognition. Cycles of collapse, limits of growth, non-central consciousness, cosmic indifference, time as structure rather than flow. These ideas no longer sound heretical. They sound familiar. Perhaps the councils were never meant to protect the text forever. Perhaps their true role was to ensure the message survived intact until humanity could approach it without myth, without panic, without worship. If that is the case, then the question is no longer what they are hiding. The question is whether we have reached the moment those texts were waiting for. Because if every civilization left a message, the most dangerous version would not be carved into stone or whispered in myth. It would be written plainly and guarded. What if the way we divide history is the illusion, not the truth? What if the neat labels we use, Sumerian, Egyptian, Indus, Mayan, Chinese, are not separate stories at all, but artificial breaks in something continuous? What if history is not a collection of isolated civilizations rising and falling independently, but a single long transmission, interrupted again and again, rebooted, fragmented, and resumed under new names? Imagine history not as a timeline, but as a manuscript written across millennia. Every time a civilization collapses, a few pages are torn out, others are smudged, but the writing never truly stops. It resumes elsewhere, in a new script, with new metaphors, but carrying the same underlying ideas forward. If you read it this way, the repetition across cultures stops being mysterious and starts feeling intentional. Consider how civilizations emerge. They do not begin at zero. The first cities appear already knowing agriculture, astronomy, geometry, metallurgy, and symbolic thought. There is no long global prologue of ignorance. Instead, there are sudden jumps. Knowledge appears compressed, as if inherited rather than invented. This makes sense if civilizations are not origin points, but receivers. Look at what repeats every time. The same obsession with the sky, the same concern with cycles of time, the same symbols of ascent, balance, collapse, and renewal, the same warnings encoded in myth, the same mathematics carved into stone, the same restricted knowledge guarded by councils, the same feeling that something important is being remembered rather than discovered. This is exactly how a message behaves when it must survive repeated destruction. Imagine a civilization that understands it will not last, that knows floods, climate shifts, cosmic events, or internal collapse are inevitable. What would it do with its most important knowledge? It would not rely on books alone. It would not trust a single archive. It would fragment the message, embed it everywhere, disguise it in symbols, myths, numbers, language structures, architecture, and ritual. It would ensure that even if 90% is lost, the remaining 10% would be enough to reconstruct the core idea. This is how redundancy works in information theory. Critical data is repeated across multiple channels so that loss does not equal erasure. The cost is clarity. The benefit is survival. Now look again at history. The same ideas appear in stone when writing fails, in myth when stone erodes, in language when myth is dismissed, in mathematics when language fragments, in pattern when mathematics is forgotten. The medium changes, but the message persists. Civilizations fall, but the transmission adapts. This reframes collapse entirely. The fall of a civilization is not necessarily failure. It may be a page turn, a forced transition to a new chapter when the current one becomes unreadable. The message continues, but the font changes. This would explain why ancient cultures seemed less concerned with permanent dominance and more concerned with alignment, preservation, and continuity. Why so much effort was put into monuments that outlast usefulness. Why knowledge was hidden rather than broadcast. Why symbols were preferred over explicit explanations. Explicit explanations do not survive resets. If history is a single message, then what is it saying? It does not appear to be instructional in the technological sense. It does not give blueprints for machines or formulas for power. Instead, it focuses relentlessly on structure, on how reality behaves, on cycles, limits, thresholds, and returns. It warns that growth without balance leads to collapse, that ignorance of cycles leads to repetition, that the sky is not passive, that time is not linear, that human systems are temporary, but patterns are not. This is not the message of conquerors, it is the message of observers. Notice also what is absent. No civilization leaves a clear, explicit claim of ultimate authority. No ancient culture declares itself the final stage of humanity. There is humility embedded everywhere, a sense of participation rather than ownership. Gods die, worlds reset, ages end. Even the most powerful empires speak of predecessors and successors. That humility feels learned. If earlier chapters existed and were lost, later chapters would inherit a sense of fragility, a knowledge that dominance is temporary, that survival depends on remembering what matters, not on ruling forever. This also explains the strange tone of ancient warnings. They are not panicked, they are resigned, calm, cyclical. This has happened before, it will happen again. That is not fear speaking, that is memory. Now consider our own time. We pride ourselves on being different, advanced, final. We speak of the end of history, of permanent progress, and yet, we are rediscovering the same truths through different tools. Climate cycles, systemic collapse, nonlinear growth, tipping points, cosmic vulnerability, limits to expansion. We are rederiving the same conclusions the ancients encoded in myth and stone, but using equations and simulations instead of stories. This suggests we are not inventing new knowledge. We are converging on the same message again, which raises the most uncomfortable question of all. If history is a single forgotten message, then where are we in it? Are we at the beginning of a chapter, still confident, still dismissive of collapse? Or are we near the end of a chapter, where complexity peaks, systems strain, and warnings become impossible to ignore? Are we meant to finish the message or pass it on? The message does not appear to demand worship. It does not ask for obedience. It asks for recognition, for pattern awareness, for humility in the face of cycles larger than any civilization. Perhaps the ultimate message is not, "This will happen," but "This keeps happening." And perhaps the reason it is fragmented is because no single generation is meant to hold the entire truth. Total knowledge may be destabilizing, but partial knowledge, rediscovered again and again, nudges humanity toward the same realizations without overwhelming it. A civilization that understands it is part of a larger cycle, behaves differently than one that believes it is the culmination of history. If we are chapters in a single message, then our role may not be to escape the cycle, but to become conscious of it, to decide whether repetition must always mean collapse, or whether recognition can finally change the outcome. Messages survive by being misinterpreted until the reader is ready. Perhaps history itself is not trying to teach us facts. Perhaps it is trying to teach us timing. And perhaps the message has been waiting for a chapter capable of realizing that it is not the author of history, but the reader. And readers, once aware, can choose how the next chapter is written.